Alrighty. Well, good morning. My name is Claire Barrett, as I said, and I'm the archives manager at Mayor Archive Collective. And today we have two really fantastic filmed interviews that we want to show you all. The first one is with Keith Gunn from California. He very generously gave us his time recently to talk about his journey to Baba and all the incredible writing and editing work that he has done both in India and the United States. And then our second interview is with Ward Parks. He's a very busy man, so I'm really glad we got some time to talk to him. Ann Barker sat down with him recently to get a researcher's perspective on the importance of archives and the work that scholars do. So if everyone is ready, did you make me co-host? Okay, good. Well, I'm going to turn off my camera. And then
Okay, so take it away, Keith.
Hi, my name is Keith Gunn. I'm one of the three Gunn brothers who follow Baba. We're poor relations of the Nordines, of course, since there's 7 of them and only 3 of us. But we do have one distinction. Bonnie once used to go on about 7 brides for 7 brothers. And when I heard her say it, I couldn't resist sticking my hand up and saying, with all due respect, we managed to achieve it in only 3. But there are 3 Gunn brothers who follow Baba, and the history of how that happened is very straightforward. It's probably in coming to God in North Carolina, but maybe not all of it. John heard about Meher Baba first. He and Barbara attended a rock concert where the rock band was called The Gods. And an intermission of this rather drugged out affair, Rick Chapman strode onto the stage as only he could and said, "You think you're high? I will tell you about the highest of the high tomorrow." And he named a location in the ecclesiastical part of Chapel Hill University of North Carolina. And that day, something like 50 people attended his talk, at which he convinced the 50 people that Meher Baba was God. And to this day, 40 of them are still Baba lovers, by John's reckoning. At any rate, John called Brad and said, "God in human form is alive and well and living in India." And Brad said, "Of course, I'll be right there." Left what he was doing and came to Chapel Hill to find out the full story. For me, it took forever. They called me up and said, "Baba is who he says he is." And we stopped using drugs, and I was very enthusiastic, at least about the latter. So they sent me a book, I put it on a shelf, and in a couple of years I began to take it really seriously. That all culminated in an event in 1970 when I was walking down the street, saw a portrait of Meher Baba painted by Dot Lesnick, and realized, or was told in no uncertain terms, that Baba was who he said he was.
What city was that?
And that was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I was fortunate to find the Baba group soon thereafter. And so I had a kind of new family. I went to India in '72 with my wife, who is not a Baba lover, and really only managed to convince her to stay for 3 days in Ahmednagar. But she met Baba's Mandali, and I met Baba's Mandali, which was, of course, the beginning of the treat of a lifetime. And then we left and went around India. I came back in '83 for the first time. So that's an 11-year hiatus. In that 11 years, I felt like unworthy to be a Baba lover, and eventually went back to India and found Baba again. And from '83 on, I was pretty frequent visitor to India, maybe 20 odd times. Cindy Lowe's got me beat, but a lot of times in any case. I met toward the end of that first decade, maybe, let's see, that's '83. By about 95 or 97, I met Professor Amiya Kumar Hazra. And Hazra is a character in the Baba world, as any of you know who have read Memoirs of a Zetetic, his original work. After Memoirs of a Zetetic, he and I co-authored a book called Of Men and Meher Baba, and another work called Seekers of Love. And I rewrote a second edition to Memoirs of a Zetetic, which comes in a kind of a brown cover, whereas the original was in pink. The distinction between the two is really only that I rewrote the language of the first 50-odd pages. Hazra had written it in homage to Wordsworth, I later learned. My formal English education not being that great, I'm an engineer. But homage to Wordsworth. And I took it out for the second edition, whereupon Bal Natu took me aside and said, "You wrecked this book." I said, "Oh gosh, what a shame." Then another Indian took me aside and said, "All us young guys are so glad you changed that at the beginning, because we couldn't follow. The homage to Wordsworth was just too deep for them." And I rewrote it in plainer language, and it made it less of a barrier. I had realized that it was something of a barrier when I first encountered Memoirs of a Zetetic, which had been 3 or 4 years prior to that. I was at an LA Sahabas, and Jeff Lowe, my buddy, said, "You need this book." So I got the book, and sure enough, I thought it was wonderful, and I hope you all do too. In Memoirs of a Zetetic, Hazra presents himself as a person who was absolutely difficult to prove. It was difficult for him to accept without proof any assertion whatsoever. So that's the definition of a Zetetic, which I hadn't really known. A word I hadn't known. Hazra was a professor of English, and he had impressive scholarly credentials. And I won't tip you off to all the interesting stuff that's in Memoirs of a Zetetic, except to say one thing that he really didn't want to tell people by name was that he was the person who introduced Meher Baba to Rajneesh, the two of them being professors in the same school, along with Gokaran Srivastava. So he thought that if he mentioned that, the world would fall on his head, the rage of the Rajneeshis being well known. Anyhow, one story from that period really amuses me, and if you haven't heard it, I think maybe it's mentioned in Memoirs of a Zetetic. But Hazra gained powers at a certain stage, and his powers were in extreme intuition, which is another thing that Adi Jr. had. Extreme intuition, and the way he would normally keep it to himself. But on one occasion, a man came in and said to him, "Hazraji, I have bought a piece of land. I put a deposit down on it. Do you think that was wise?" Hazra reflected for a moment and said, "No, it wasn't wise. The guy has sold it 3 times to other people beforehand. Go back and get your money if you can." The guy rushed out the door of Hazra's residence and later was able to get his money back. But the next morning, Hazra woke up in his living room where his bed was, where he had like 6 beds, And he walked out the door to stretch, and there was a line of 50 people waiting to see him. So he was in a total panic. He'd let the cat out of the bag at some level, and it turns out to have been not such a great idea. So he called up his friend, the doctor, and he said, "Doctor, I need your help. I'm a heart patient. I'm about to die, and I'm dying at your hospital. Can I come and stay in your hospital for like 6 months?" And the guy said, "Yeah, sure, Amir, come on." And so Amir rushed out of the house, went to the hospital, somehow came out of the house. Maybe his friends carried him out. That's another story. Anyhow, he stayed there for 6 months till the crowd dissipated because he was on the point of death, and they figured, heck, we just missed our chance. Well, my first meeting with Hazra is in the notes of the Memoirs of a Zetetic in the foreword, but essentially we came into contact. I told him how much I loved his book, and he said, "Yes, I have another one, and I want you to write it for me and publish it." We found MVRK Biology to actually do the publishing, so all I had to do was compose the text or recompose the text. That was an editing job, but it was a fairly extensive edit, so he suggested I become a co-author, which I was proud to be. That's called Of Men and Meher Baba. And it's a story of a spiritual seeker who has found Meher Baba, has come back to the U.S., met other people, and convinces them all to go on a pilgrimage to India. And it's actually the composite of a lot of experiences that he had, people and experiences that he had, but it's all set in a fictional setting. So that book didn't sell particularly well. As an example, the archives at Asheville have at least 5 copies of it. But I enjoyed doing it, and it was a precondition by Hazra for me helping produce a second edition of Memoirs of a Zetetic. So if you see Memoirs of a Zetetic in the pink, that's the pre-exorcism of the Wordsworth, and in the brown, it's somewhat more than that. Although there's not much new, there's more source material. So that was sort of my time with Hazra. It seems like previously I had gone to India with Andy Muir to help Andy around India. So as Andy was a diabetic, Hazra was a heart patient, and between a staff of me and several other people, more important people than me, we got Hazra around India. I and Mary Santamore Weiss got Andy around India too. So maybe somebody will help me around India sometime. Want to ask a question?
And now starting about the journey to God, true story of Jurgadevi P. Gilnani.
Oh, okay. Well, what happened was, as soon as it became known among Indian Baba lovers that I was helping Hazra and I was a resource, I got offered a number of tasty jobs. One of them was around Bailey's Diaries, and I'll tell you that one quickly, and then I'll come back to the other. You know who Bailey Irani is if you're a Baba lover. He's kind of the prodigal son, except he's really not that prodigal. He misbehaves throughout his life and leaves Baba. But he starts life as Baba's close chum, another what Baba used to call Langoti friends, meaning even when they were in the diapers, they were friends, of whom Dr. Gunny is one. So Bailey wrote a number of autobiographies. He wrote one in the 20s. He wrote another one in the 30s, and he wrote, I think the 30s, and he wrote this final one in the mid 1970s, while he was in a assisted living facility in Hyderabad. One of the nurses there was a Baba lover, and upon his death, she took the original manuscripts to H.P. Barucha, Dr. Barucha. And Dr. Barucha got together a bunch of friends to create an English version of it. And the actual dictation, the translation from Parsi Gujarati to English was done by Cyrus Kambata, who everybody who knows Bombay knows well, assisted by others who read the Gujarati script to him. At the beginning, Kishore Mistry. After that, Arij Bohariwala from Navsari. And they sent me the physical manuscripts and said, can you put this in the computer for us? And by the way, improve the language if you think it's necessary. So I did that for the 6 volumes of Bailey's Diary, and then sent copies around. Bailey's Diary is a funny book because it's Bailey's excuses as much as anything for what he did. But in the process of giving the excuses, he's compelled to describe Baba in ways that not so many people heard. He was doing the work on a biography of Upasani Maharaj that Baba sent him to do in the Jopri in 1920, must be 2-3. If I had Peter Nordine here, he'd tell me the date and week, and I think it's actually in Lord Mayor, but you can look it up easily. The Jopri that was in the woods and is now in the middle of utterly downtown Bombay, but was woods then in 1920s. So Bailey tells a lot about Baba, and at the same time he tells about himself and the things he did, but he doesn't tell them the way they happened. He tells them the way he wished they had happened, I think. At any rate, the diary is a secondary resource, and I think the best parts of it are found retold in Nashirwan's biography of Baba that covers the early years and has only recently come out, this being 2023. Maybe before COVID, I think Nashirwan produced that biography. I, of course, gave Nashirwan my notes, and it turned out that all the chapters of the book were with Cyrus except one, which had been lost. And that one was subsequently found, and Nashirwan made another translation of it, and David Fenster also got a translation of it. And at least one of those translations is with the archives in Asheville. So the second half of your question, Indian authors began coming to me. They'd find me at the Pilgrim Center, and they would say, "I've got a book. I need a little English improvement." And one of those was, there was a book on Dr. Kilnani's family, on Mrs. Kilnani, which Indian Baba lovers to this day know as Mrs. Kilnani's book. And there's another one by a famous guy from Hamirpur. And I did do some rewrite on both of those books. Not the full scope of rewrite I would have done, but at least I think I may have improved the English in parts of them. So that's your question.
Because you had how long to do that editing?
Oh, well, yeah, typically what would happen is the editor would say, "Here's the book, I need the answer back in 9 days. So just tweak the language and give it back to me in 9 days." Well, in 9 days, you can't really totally rewrite. And so what I would have to do is just tune the language a little bit.
Okay. And Seekers of Love, can you tell me a little bit about how that?
Oh, wonderful question for me.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yes, of course. The question is, what about Seekers of Love? Hazra's third book was one called Seekers of Love, and we worked on it intensively for quite a period of time, probably around the year 2000, if memory serves. At any rate, Hazra knew a lot of Indian Bible lovers who didn't speak English and whose stories were therefore not in common associations of stories known among the Westerners. And he thought it would be good to get them to tell their stories in Hindi, and then he would translate them into English. I would tweak the English, and I would do the computer work, and there would be a book. And this one has, I don't know, maybe 20 stories of them. I think some of them are fairly profound. And some people in the West knew some, particularly ones who were big India travelers. And sometimes, as with the Pratap Iyer, sometimes as with Pratap, the Western people do know his stories because he speaks both English and Hindi. But there were some of them who speak only Hindi. One, for example, I particularly liked, the guy. He was a stage magician. He had very good sleight of hand skills, and he used to go up and do his show. But in India, particularly in the hinterlands, if you do something that's magic, maybe you have spiritual powers, and maybe you can help them. The level of difficulty of life for a poor person in India is pretty daunting. And if they had some guy who had spiritual powers who could make them money or help them out getting their kids married or whatever it was that was their current crisis, that would be really attractive. And so these people began coming up on stage and kissing his feet, and he realized he got a following in the sense that he got people he could charge admission for, but the response was entirely different from the one you would expect if a guy came up and did stage magic in the West. I don't think anybody really kisses Huey's feet lately, for example. But this guy realized that he was at risk, and he ran into Meher Baba's people and found out about Meher Baba, and used to go on the tours with them. So I met him, and he told his full story, which is in Seekers of Love.
Okay.
By the way, if you see me shaking, it's because I have Parkinson's, which seems to run in the community.
And how about memoirs of Gulmai Irani?
Oh, that's a good one. What about Memoirs of Gulmai? Maybe 7 or 8 years ago, maybe a little bit more, David Fenster handed me 2 documents in English and a reference to another couple. The documents were different tellings at different times, probably by different people, of the life story of Gulmai Irani, Adi's mother. And it's a really fascinating story. But there were different instances described in the 2 manuscripts. And the problem was to knit the 2 manuscripts together into one, trying to puzzle out what happened before and what happened after with respect to one manuscript's event. A second manuscript's event would be there. I did the best I could. Peter Nordin says I'm off by a year. He's probably right. But in any case, the dates are as consecutive as I could make them, and the passages. And in it, there's a lengthy passage about Gulmai being beaten by Upazni Maharaj. And some people would automatically cringe away from that. But Gulmai's own words about that, where it wasn't basically that much fun to be being beaten, but the state she found herself in after the beating was one that she would pay anything, do anything to attain a state of inner harmony that she describes in some detail. It's a very interesting book in that Gulmai was a very interesting person with an amazing life story. Adi also wrote about her in the one of the two early publications. This one appeared in about 1939. So it's there. And Nadi wrote again a little bit about her. So I was able to integrate those two things into the story. Adi said, and I think this is an interesting commentary on spiritual seekers in general, that she was very fixed. She was not going to be pushed out of her way toward what she felt and what she wanted by others. And so it made her a little uncompromising. But it's such a wonderful story. It's now come out as a book form. David Fenster has produced a book on Gulmai, and I recommend it to people. If they ever really care about trying to figure out how much of it is specific to her own language, they can come to the archives in Asheville and look at the original source documents.
What kind of obstacles did you run into as you were trying to work with all these people who were in India? Gosh,
the question is, were there obstacles in working with the people in India? I've already mentioned the 9-day constraint, but other than that, I had a great time doing it and would like to do it again if I had the time. The Indian manuscripts are full of new stuff that most of us haven't heard anything about. Oh, as one postscript to that, I should add, Hazra wrote one more thing before he died, and this one in this one he was assisted by his grandson Titu Mukherjee, called "Faded or Forgotten Flowers." Do you remember what the real name is? I think it's "Faded Flowers," but that's not like Hazra, so maybe it's forgotten. Anyhow, that one has had very little circulation. There's a copy in Asheville. I was given a copy by the authors. And that talks about more mundane things in his life. His dog, Jimmy, his experiences. But it's still a spiritual book, even though the portion of it that relates to the dog is, to my mind, maybe not of that much interest to people unless you're a dog lover, in which case this is a dog with so much personality. Hazra lived in Jabalpur, and I went to Jabalpur many times for this work. And his building had a first floor and a roof, and so we used to go up on the roof sometimes. And that's where the story of Jimmy has particularly interesting connections to what the dog does on the roof. But maybe you'll get a chance to see that. Enough, I think so.
Any thoughts about archiving Baba's treasures?
Well, I can tell anybody who's interested in Baba's treasures that Asheville has quite a few, and as well as a lot of manuscripts from various people. Darwin Shaw, for one. And the physical archives here are attended to by Elaine Cox, who had training in archive management from the archive in Mehrabad. I was only able to give a small number of things to that because I only had a small number of things, nothing of terrible importance. But one of them is, it's a funny story all by itself. Like all of us, I had copies of Glimpses of the God-Man, which ran to 6 volumes if memory serves. And because I'm a computer guy, I converted the manuscripts to digital format. That meant scanning and optical character recognition. And I was doing some of that stuff as part of my daytime job, so I had all the tools to do it. And because I had all 6 manuscripts, I could make a list from the manuscripts of all the initially capitalized words, so people and places and ships and things like that. And so I had this long list, and sorted in alphabetical order. It made it fairly clear that the standard for naming had moved around from book to book. And that's a problem for archives, because if you want to retrieve, if you have somebody who comes to you and says, I want to know all about my uncle, his name was, you don't know whether that name has appeared, and you can't search directly for that name in your archive, even if you have full text search, because it's named differently, so it must be a different person. So I went back to Bal. I said, here's a long list of all the names of people, places, and things in your book. Do you want to conform these to one standard? And because we need it for archive work. He said, yeah, sure. And so we sat for quite some time while he said, well, name is a rendering that is peculiar to Marathi version of this guy's name, and here's another name that's Gujarati specific, and here's another name that's Hindi specific, and to the extent that we mix those up, we ought to standardize on one name. So we did. Now the one that you're all familiar with is the spelling of Gujarat. G-U-J-A-R-A-T, G-U-J-R-A-T, G-U-J-E-R-A-T. They've all appeared in various publications and various documents. And so that's a problem which isn't solvable in everything, but it's solvable in the context of a single author. So Balnatu now had an electronic version of 6 volumes of his work, and they all had the names and people names and place names and all that in one standard way. So I thought I'd done something useful. And Bal thought I had too, so he gave me a coin, which I've given to the archives in Asheville. And that coin is one that Baba gave him. Baba gave him 5 coins, as a bunch, 5 similar coins, probably identical, without explanation. And I know he gave one to Steve Klein, because Steve did a great amount of work on getting the glimpses together. And he gave one, I think, to Patty Thorne's daughter, Adrian, who worked for him as a typist for a long period of time. And he gave me one, which, I don't know, maybe he was running out of people to give coins to. Maybe that was the last one. Anyway, so I gave that on to but it's the only time I think I've ever had anything that Baba touched. And so it's gone. Enough, I think.
Let me ask you another question. So can you tell us a little bit about your life in terms of ordinary working? You worked with computers, you did this, you played jazz guitar. Just fill in a few details.
Quickie. Born in 41, Brother John came along in 44 and Brad in 47. My parents were musical. They had music in the house, and so I listened to it from a very early age. And they were jazz fans of a kind of jazz that I don't play, traditional jazz. But it meant that I could hear the harmonies. And harmonies are the thing that distinguishes jazz from other kinds of music. Popular jazzers' joke is 5 chords, 1,000 people, that's rock and roll. 1,000 chords, 5 people, that's jazz. So, at any rate, I liked harmony, and I sang in the church choir and stuff like that. And by the age of 15, I was performing as a musician in public with other jazz players, because traditionally jazz is a combo, right? So there was a great tenor saxophone player in where we grew up in New Jersey, my age. There were good drummers and good bass players, and I played guitar. I was in guitar. I was the guitar player in the band at my prep school, a guitar player in bands at Harvard, one of which was really a 16-piece big band. So the jazz chair there was mainly provide rhythm. And then after that, after I got out of college, I made my living playing music sometimes. But also I knew something about computing. And eventually by 1983 or so, by 1983 I was doing computer stuff. My computer stuff is not of interest to you all, but I knew enough, I had enough experience so that I could use the computer in ways that are more like computer programming than like computer end user stuff normally is. And I did that up until about retirement in 2003, I think. 2004 I retired because I'd made enough money. But then I got called back by a friend and went back to work on automating the capture of the tax returns of the state of California, which was an interesting project. But all this left me lots of time to go see Baba in the post 1983 era, because one company sent me to the Middle East back and forth, and so each time I would go to the Middle East, I would go to see Baba's people, go to Mehrabad. So like Don Stevens, but without the physical contact of Meher Baba.
And another question. Tell us about your parents and the interesting work that your parents did.
Oh, my dad was the question has been about our parents. My father was a very religious man. And my mother was also quite tolerant of religion. She was a church organist and a choir director. And so our father was a radio and television producer and director. My earliest memories of going to New York with him was to go to a recording studio where they were recording the source material for radio programs on the West Coast. But he was in New York. So he was doing a series, well, it's after, he had already done a series of recordings of World War II. And that was one of the ways he was out of the draft, was he had children, but he was also the director of a series called, a series about correspondence in World War II, telling real stories about what happened. That series, the name escapes me for a second, but I'll get it in a minute. Anyway, I went to see him doing soap opera because he had a soap opera job. But he quit those, became a professor of communications in upstate New York after finishing a teaching certificate and a master's in communications. And he was on a first name basis with a lot of church people who he had on one of his shows, which was called Look Up and Live, which came in public broadcasting in New York. So he was involved in all of that. Delightful fellow. We all loved him.
And now you're about to move to?
And now I'm about to move to the city of San Miguel de Allende in Guanajuato State in Mexico, having lived in California from 83 to 2023.
Mm-hmm. Do you and your wife speak Spanish?
My wife is articulate in Spanish. I have very little, but I think I may have to pick some up because although the people we interact with include people who are good in English, there are a few who aren't, and they're really delightful people. San Miguel de Allende was first visited by the Baba lover Flag Chris, so, and I think there are some other Baba lovers who've been there. I'm not sure, there may be one couple there now. I'm going to see if I can find them.
Thank you, Keith.
Bless.
Thank you,
Jai
Keith.
Baba.
Jai Baba.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to ask if anyone would like a quick break before I start our next video with Ward Parks.
I'm happy to go with the flow.
Alrighty, I just want to double check. Okay, awesome. Of
Thank you.
course.
Hello, my name is Ann Barker, and I'm a board member of the Meher Archive Collective. Welcome to today's Baba Zoom program. First of all, I want to thank Phil Ludwig. We are here in his Seclusion Hill studio and here in Asheville, and Phil has recorded many of the Meher Baba programs through the years and also so much of the Baba music. So he is a real treasure in our community. Our guest today is Ward Parks, and Ward has dedicated the latter part of his life to researching and writing about Meher Baba's words and work, and we want to find out more today about what Ward has done with archives, and also just to mention a few of the books that Ward has written: Creation and Its Causes, Infinite Intelligence. He was also involved with Heart Talks, William Donkin's Diaries, 1939 to 1946, and his music CDs, at least two of them, Baba Who and Beautiful Songs by Ward Parks. So thank you so much, Ward, for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
We really want to talk about the importance of archives and the archive work research that you've been doing.
Yeah, my dealings with archives have not been as an archivist. I've never been that, but rather as a user. The work that I've been doing for the last 30 years has been working with Meher Baba's words preserved in manuscripts and other forms, and doing all the research connected with them and editing them into publishable, readable books. So there's been quite a bit that's been done. This has been in connection with the Avatar Meher Baba Trust. So I'm vividly conscious of the indispensability of preserved materials. Shall I give a little anecdote relating to this? Just an example of it is I had been working in a publication group at the Avatar Meher Baba Trust when Merwan Jesawala, the brother of Eric Jesawala, said that he had something to tell us all, and what it concerned was a collection of manuscripts that had been found not long after Baba dropped the body. They were in a black leather briefcase and had been stored in a what's called a go-down storage room. It's the rice go-down is the name of it, where they kept rice at Mirazad. That was their archival facility at the time. And it must have been there since Baba's time. And Erich sent Balna II, who was not living there yet, but was close to, very intimate with Baba and the Mandali, to check in the rice go-down. Erich must have somehow had the idea that something was there, because that's where I kept rice for cooking. And he came back with this briefcase, and it contained the source manuscripts for what has since then been published as Infinite Intelligence, a major 700-page book now, Tiffin Lectures, published in 2017, and most recently, Creation and Its Causes. And if that briefcase had been lost, if those materials had not been preserved, it would have been a major loss for humanity. All three of these books are important bodies of discourse from the Avatar of the Age from the 1920s. We would have no idea I think there are some records that Baba gave discourses in the time, but no one would have any idea what they were. So this is an illustration of the importance which these old materials have in establishing Meher Baba's, what it is, and as the foundation for a whole culture and civilization based on the legacy of the Avatar of the Age. It always happens, and it will happen again this time.
Many people wonder, why are we even bothering to create archives? And yet there was a story told, and I'm paraphrasing, that one of the women, Mandali, asked Meher Baba, Baba, your sadras are getting so worn out. Why don't we just get rid of these and we'll make some new ones for you? And his response was, you have no idea. Even a tiny scrap of my sadra will be a treasure in future years. And we're seeing that now.
Yeah. Speaking, as I say, my mode of relation to, archival collections is as a user entirely. I've never done any of the actual work itself, which is a very difficult line of work, and it's a whole science. But I could differentiate between two kinds of archival things, objects. Those that are, in their essence, replicable, reproducible, and those which, in their essence, are not. To illustrate, a sadra is not replicable. Now, you can take pictures, and you can, do representations in many forms. I'm not denying the value of that. But when it comes down to it, the essential thing is the sadra, which is irreplaceable and irreduplicable. But the other category would be something like a manuscript. Let's suppose that Baba gave a talk, and someone took notes and wrote it down. Now, the manuscript is of permanent worth, but the essence of it is actually in the content. So that calls for a whole new different set of imperatives. That is to say, scanning of it and the sharing of it. And the conditions of sharing are very different. For a sadra, you have to be much more restrictive, because if people are handling it all the time, it will be destroyed. But in the case of, let's say, a diary of Chanji's, the original can be kept safe and intact, but digital scans can indeed be shared and need to be. So that's a very important part of the whole greater context of archives, the making these contents accessible. That's critical. It's not like a manuscript, it's not like a holy object. Okay, it could be that too, but a lot of its value lies in the use of it. So I think it's really, really important part of the archival process to be in relationship with researchers, with scholars, with editors, and with publishers, and also in our Baba world with other archival collections. I think that's really, really critical. No one archives is going to have everything.
Well, that leads me to the question, which specific archives have you contacted and been able to use some of their materials?
Yeah, no, I've dealt with a lot, because when I started doing this research and editing with Bao and Marwan and Jesawala way back in the 1990s, not much had been done yet. So naturally, I've worked with contents from the Avatar Meher Baba Trust archives, to be sure. But I would deal with a lot of others. For example, Chris and Christy Pearson in California, Mariposa, inherited Phyllis Frederick's archives. And it turned out that there were really important and utterly surprising materials relevant to what I was doing. I was working at that time on Tiffin Lectures. It's a collection of talks Baba gave that's produced a typed manuscript, and Marwan and I had been working with this typed manuscript. But this manuscript had a lot of, they're called lacunae, that's the term for it, that is gaps, where the typing, suddenly there's a gap because it was meant to be filled in by handwritten Gujarati, or else by a diagram that was to be hand-drawn. And the manuscript never filled them in. And by total surprise, it turned out that the Pearsons had from Phyllis a carbon copy of that same typed manuscript, and in the carbon copy, all the lacunae were filled in. They didn't do it on the top sheet copy, they did it on the carbon copy. So we got a lot of the diagrams and the Gujarati, a lot of those words, we just could not, the diagrams, we could never have guessed. So this is an illustration of a case where the two archives absolutely had to be brought into coordination with each other to do the work. I've had a lot of dealings also with the center. They helped out. There was another two projects, a revised 6th edition of the Discourses and a book, Early Messages from the West. And in both of those, the center made accessible a lot of their materials, as did Buzz and Wendy Connor, who personally have a lot of contents like that also. And I also did a lot of work with the archives of Avatar Meher Baba Trust. There's a new edition of Stay with God, Francis Brabazon's masterpiece, which Baba said was second in importance only to God Speaks. So to do this new edition of it, which will be coming out soon, the archives there made available all the source manuscripts and correspondence, which turned out to be quite important. Of course, the Sufism oriented has helped too. So I've worked with a lot of archival collections all around the Baba world, and it's going to be absolutely critical to establish frameworks of sharing between the different archival collections. On a lot of these projects, if I had been limited to just one of them, the work really couldn't have been done properly.
And one thing that we're finding is that really is just the tip of the iceberg, because we have hundreds of tapes that have yet to be transcribed. And so there's so much work that needs to be done. And that leads me to the point that we really need young people to become historians and archivists to take part in some of this work. And what do you think about how can we manage to support some of these young historians and young scholars who, where we've got so much work that needs to be done?
Well, one thing to attract people in the first place is not for archiving not to be cut off from the other aspects of the greater process. Because some people, for example, with manuscripts, would take an interest in the processes of preserving a manuscript and so forth. Some people are not going to be interested in that at all, but would be interested from the standpoint of a historical project where you delve into materials like this and read them and take notes on them. Also, there can be, I mean, the MAC is ideally set up for it. It's up to the people running it to decide they want to do this, but to have a week-long program on some topic where you could look at some of the archival materials, look at the historical research materials, have creative projects, maybe have a song program based on these things. I think that would really bring these things to life a lot. But it really is critical for an archives not just to be locked up and kept from other people. That's an issue, actually. Sometimes a kind of possessiveness can come to be associated with archives where, naturally out of the desire to protect it, actually it winds up being locked off and kept away from people. That's been a big issue for me. It's just, I mean, in every line of work, like I'm a scholar, and scholars tend to be proud of their knowledge and contemptuous of people who don't know so much. And perhaps, people in the financial line might like their gold, sit on their stack of money and not give it. So there tends to be a possessiveness that attaches to anything. And so I think with a research and archival center like MAC, it really will be important to be conscious of this and consciously counteract some of the possessiveness of course, a certain protectiveness is needed. That really, in many ways, not just for the physical objects, but for the copyrights. Copyrights are distinct from the archival object, and you can't disregard that side of it. There's a good curatorship that has to happen, but I really do feel in our BABA world right now, a very high order imperative is for collaboration between different stages in the process of sharing this content and between different archival centers. I would hope that MAC would be interested in moving to be not just an archives, but an archives and research center, and then even educational. You could have programs where people could spend time learning about something.
Well, just as you're mentioning, it brings to my mind the Darwin and Jean Shaw collection that we are currently working on, and I can definitely see a 1 week program discussing some of the rich content that we're finding.
Yeah, like in something like that, let's suppose you took just one part of Darwin's experience, the 1954 3 Incredible Weeks of Harvest, which was, a lot of that is included in one of his books. Well, such a program could perhaps get in touch with what is it, Majestic or Beads on a String collection from Don Stevens. Oh, no, he actually wasn't there. But
I was recently found out that the Southern California Baba Archive has some of the early materials too from that time.
So that would be an example of a collaborative dimension to this.
Fred Marks, I was trying to think.
Yeah, Fred Marks. Okay,
Marks.
I think Sue Chapman may be working with some of his stuff right now. So have all these links and connections, and maybe there could be film and video brought into the whole experience. There is films from that time. Baba gave his final declaration at that time. So again, to look at things in a wider context that makes them richer and more fulfilling and more connected with Baba's greater life story. I think we are at the stage where that really is important.
Oh yeah, I can see that happening too.
Yeah. And it will make it, bring it to life. I mean, a lot of younger people, I think, just sitting in a room and just, filing papers, how boring. Well, some people don't find that boring. I will say this, as a scholar, when I was 20, saving the world seemed like a good idea. But now that I'm 70, if I could just improve myself a tiny little bit, that's as much as I can hope to do. But a part of that whole process is not just grand things, but the littlest things turn out to have great value and to be very interesting. I think most people who develop in a craft experience that, the love of the little things. So it is true that when you get deeply into a line of work, you see the beauty in a little, speck of dust. So that is one part. But also, I mean, if archiving is in a living relationship with all these other things, people will see more immediately its value. It's not just in a piece of paper or something. There's a story connected with it. There's a worldview that Baba, there's a discourse connected with it. There's an aspect of Baba's beauty and magnificence connected with it. If all those things can become part of it, people will be drawn.
One aspect that we find particularly fascinating is here in the United States, how did all of these disparate people find out about Meher Baba, and what were the channels that brought them to Meher Baba, and even some of the tiny things which we might think of as ephemera, such as a plane ticket from 1969 or 1978, those things are really important. And just the issue of scholars in the future who will be saying, asking mundane questions such as, how did all these Baba followers afford to travel to the other side of the world to even go to Mehrabad and Merazad?
Right, the life stories that are connected with their darshan experience. Here's a little example of a tiny little detail. I don't know if I can explain it well enough without actually showing the chart involved, but in 1925, Meher Baba hand-wrote this manuscript that was published as In God's Hand. Some people might be acquainted with it. 39 pages in his own handwriting. And on the 29th page, Baba drew out a little diagram of 5 states: wakefulness, dream, sound sleep, wakeful dreaming, and wakeful sound sleep. Wakeful sound sleep means God realization. And that turns out to be a very important idea. And Baba created many, many diagrams on the subject. Well, in God Speaks, almost 30 years later, there's a diagram that is a much more developed version of that very same idea. And when Meron and I were working on Infinite Intelligence, it so happened there popped up from archives a postcard. And on the back side, we have in Erich's handwriting, wakefulness, dream, sound sleep, wakeful dreaming, and wakeful sound sleep. And on the back side of it, it was a postcard dated January 1954, Dehradun, not Dehradun, Mahabaleshwar, where Baba was at the time. So the likelihood that Erich would have just thought up the idea on his own is 0%. Obviously, he took down those notes from Baba's dictation, which Baba had himself written back in 1925. And almost certainly, this was the basis for that diagram in a much developed form in God Speaks. So here you have a little postcard, and it turns out to be a crucial clue in a history of Baba's discoursing between 1925 and 1954.
Oh, that is fascinating.
So you'd think just a little thing like that. I have often noticed with manuscripts, tiny little details are really, really... Yeah, there's another one with the Tiffin lectures. We didn't know... the last of the Tiffin lectures is August 1927. But we didn't know when the manuscript typed manuscript was actually compiled. Could have been years later, or it could have been, I tended to think it was right away. But then out of the version of the manuscript that the Pearsons had, tiny little handwriting, it gives the date October 1927. And that's a carbon copy. So that dates it. So, I mean, there's a lot of detective work involved. So when you know the whole history and context that's involved in it, these little tiny things come to life.
And when you can cross-reference it with materials from other archives.
There's a case.
Invaluable.
This is the Pearsons from Phyllis Frederick coming into relationship with the manuscript that had been found in the Rice Go-Down. That's what I was talking about earlier. That was one of those manuscripts. California and Merazad. So, yeah, we're only at the very beginning of all this work. Yeah.
Ward, thank you so much for joining us today and to tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Jai Baba, everybody.
Jai
Thank
Baba.
you.
Hello again. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we hop off, I want to give everyone, we'll talk a little bit for a second about Mac and some things that we're doing right now. As some of y'all probably know, Mac is getting pretty close to being able to move into our permanent home, which is very, very exciting. We've been working on renovation of our new building for quite a while, and it's so close to being done so we can move in. And obviously, it's been a lot of work, and I wanted to give everyone just a link to the fundraising that we're doing. Obviously, there's absolutely no pressure for anyone to donate, but you can pass it on to any of your friends if you wanted to. Just want to put that out there. Did anyone have any questions for me or anything they wanted to say? Hey, make sure you're unmuted.
Hi, Claire, and thanks for organising this gathering, and thanks to Anne and whoever else it was that was filming before. Both of those were really interesting to see and listen to. Just from an archivist research perspective, how soon do you think do you already have a catalogue of what you have there? And how soon do you think people might be able to access resources?
Well, we're still in the process of building our catalog right now. We're working with Seven, who has done work with other archives. So that's still kind of in the process right now. We don't have a definitive date for that, but it shouldn't be too far off, hopefully.
Okay.
And that's going to be available both to people who are able to come visit us in person, and we're also going to have it online. So anyone around the world is perfectly willing and are perfectly able to access it and see at least digital copies of basically everything that we have.
Okay, so will you be like circulating an access thing to that when that time comes?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great news. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And also, I'd like to know more about what's going on with the London Baba group and
Sure.
archives there, and whether or not you have created an online link to those materials.
I was expecting that question and frightened to answer it, and not frightened.
That's okay. I also just put my email in the chat for you or for anyone who ever wants to email me, because I would absolutely love to chat with you more. Like Anne said, we really are hoping to start building up those connections and that network, because it's not just about what MAC is doing, it's about what all the archives around the world are doing. And the more that we interconnect and the more we work together, the better everyone's archive will be.
Mhm.
So,
Amen to that. I mean,
Yeah.
David Bowling, who's in charge of the Abode Archive, and I did a lot of work together on that. And we've both worked in India as well. So I know that we both have, for example, videos of people doing document rehousing, which are teaching videos. And I know you started doing some yourself. So stuff like that we need to share. To answer your question, Anne, as best as I can, at the moment, the archive team is moi. And I have a couple of people I can call on at different times who've done a lot of wonderful work. So we finally now have a book catalogue, and we do have a number of signed copies and some pretty special editions that came from different close lovers of Barber. We have quite a lot of artifacts, and we've had some recent legacies from people that have been very sweet. And like last weekend, I was putting out stuff of Hila Talwar's. She had very close, which was with Barber from childhood. So she gifted us some beautiful things. So I have managed to rehouse now nearly all of the artifacts and physical objects that we had, and Martin Cook's photographed all the visual things that we would want to know, and I've done photographs of nearly all the artifacts that I've rehoused. So I'm now at the stage of beginning to put together Excel pages of things. We do not have at them, and we're hoping to put these onto Google Drive. As and when we can get people who are able to upload all that stuff for us. We don't have yet a central database that is accessible for other people. It's the direction I want to go in, but there's just so much work to do. So I'll keep you posted, and please, at any time you want to ask me anything, feel free to approach. More than happy to collaborate and help. Very excited about what's going on internationally with the whole archives thing. It's wonderful.
Wonderful.
And I want to visit your premises.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to have you over.
Love to have
Well,
you come.
I'm hoping to come to Myrtle Beach in the, I don't know, possibly even for Ward's weekend there, but so October, November time. And if I can at all, find a way to get up to Asheville and see what's happening there, I'd love to. I mean, I've watched all the videos that have come out that Jeannie's done, and it's a lovely journey you've all been on, and I'm so impressed by the sheer numbers of people and the heart quality that's been brought to the table. I'm talking too much, sorry.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Wow. All right. Thank you so much, Sue. And also just to reiterate what Sue said, thank you so much to Anne and Chris for everything you've done to help facilitate these talks with Ward and Keith. It's really great that we got to talk to them, because both of them are busy people. So we're really appreciative of them, and both of Anne and Chris as well. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today.
And thank you to Diana. Thanks so much for all your help, Diana.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you. This has been fun, everyone. Have a good
Hey,
rest of
Bob.
your Saturday.
Jay
Jay Baba.
Jai Baba.
Bye.
Jai Baba.